Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Adventures Through the Mind. I'm your host, as always, James W. Jesso. This is a podcast that explores topics relevant and related to psychedelic culture, medicine, and research, always with the underlying question of how can we work with and through our psychedelic experiences to become better people, not just for ourselves, but for all those with whom we are nested in relationship, human and non-human alike, presently and across time in both directions from the central location that my human consciousness measures time as an arrow moving from the past to the future. Welcome. Today's interview is going to be with Jordan Gruber, and I'll read his bio in a moment. But first, let me hold up a copy of his book. For those of you not on YouTube, me holding up a copy of this book means basically nothing to you, so sorry about that. But it is from Jordan Gruber and James Fadiman, a name many of you might recognize, especially if you are following the emergence of the microdosing scene over the last 10-ish years or something. But yes, Jordan Gruber is going to be our guest today, and we're going to be talking about the topics that they cover in the book, Your Symphony of Selves. And as per usual, I have a little overture to read for you in the opening of this interview. We are composed of many, but are never truly just one. The multiplicity of the mind is a common theme here on the podcast, but always with the inferred presence of a central self from which that multiplicity emerges and to which that multiplicity organizes. However, what if there was no central self, no ego at all? What if the multiplicity of mind, our symphony of selves, was without a conductor, akin more to a flock of starlings than to an orchestra at all? What if the single self assumption that so often dominates our prevailing sense of what it is to be is false? Furthermore, if that is the case, how do we come to understand ourselves as a me operating in a world of other me's? And how do we, as a me with a central I, navigate our many selves? And, calling in psychedelics, how do we come to understand what is happening in our so-called ego deaths if there's no such thing as an ego in the first place? Our guest for this episode of Adventures to the Mind is Jordan Gruber, and he's on the show to explore these questions with us. And here's his bio. Jordan Gruber, JDMA, has both a bachelor's in philosophy and a master's in public policy analysis and administration from Binghamton University, and a JD from the University of Virginia School of Law. After practicing law briefly, including a stint at a NASA campus, he became a writer, ghostwriter, and editor working on a wide range of subjects, from forensic audio to financial services and from health and wellness to psychology and spirituality. He is known for his creativity, editing skills, and ability to collaboratively co-create books that are not only clear and easy to read, but that often take the content well beyond the collaborator's original expectations. He also founded the once active website enlightenment.com, where he brought forth the first ever interview with American integral philosopher Ken Wilber. Along with Dr. James Fadiman, a name many of you in the psychedelic scene are likely familiar with given his role in the modern microdosing movement, Jordan Gruber is also the author of this new book, which I just held up for everyone, called Your Symphony of Selves, Discover and Understand More of Who We Are. So I will read a little bit from the book description. So here we go. Explaining that it is normal to have multiple selves, the authors offer insights into why we are inconsistent at times, allowing us to become more accepting of the different parts of who we are and other people are. They explore through extensive reviews how the concept of healthy multiple selves has been supported in science, popular culture, spirituality, philosophy, art, literature, and ancient traditions, and cite well-known people including David Bowie and Beyoncé who describe accessing another self at a pivotal point in their lives to resolve a pressing challenge. Okay, rounding out here the read from the script Overture. Some of the topics we explore in this episode includes an in-depth look at the Health Selves Model in comparison and contrast to the single self assumption, why we mistakenly assume multiple selves to be pathological, how mental health is being in the right mind or selves at the right time, and how we can start applying this healthy selves model into our lives today. We also talk about monotheism's influence on the single self assumption, quote, the single God assumption, how Buddhism's no-self and interdependence relates to multiple selves, the difference between multiple selves and Jungian archetypes and autonomous complexes, how Sigmund Freud helped the single self assumption dominate the Western mind, and how the very origins of Freud's model of the mind might have been in gaslighting sexual abuse. Furthermore, we also explore psychedelic journeying and healing from a healthy selves model, how we might understand the effects of psychedelics on the ego, if there's no such thing as an ego, as well as all of reality being fractal iterations of various holistic expressions of cosmic multiplicity, while we debate the validity of the essential self-energy, and our ability to live in relationship to ultimate reality. So it's a big episode, and I do hope you enjoy it. Before we get into it, I'd like to give a big thank you to my patrons on Patreon who make this podcast possible. Thank you so much. The names of the people listed on the screen here on YouTube are those that give significantly, some of which for a long time. So the shout out extra on the screen on the YouTube and in the credits to this episode is an extra thank you for that generosity. If you are not yet a patron and you are appreciating the show, finding value in it, please do head over to patreon.com/James W. Jesso to become a patron of the show. Anything is something, and it all adds up to the income that allows me to focus on this work, even in a larger context of things being very difficult for me right now. And those of you who have been listening to the podcast over the last little while probably know what I'm talking about. It's not necessarily getting easier, but I think things are trending in the right direction. But anyways, huzzah! Thank you for becoming a patron. You can help fund the show otherwise by one-time donations or purchasing something off the online shop or from one of our affiliates. All of that is very much appreciated, and links to all of it are in the description to this episode, wherever you're checking it out. So that's it. That's all for the intro. Please do enjoy this interview with Jordan Gruber here on Adventures Through the Mind, episode 168. Okay, so then how do I start? You know what? I'll start by taking off my headphones and returning in about 5 seconds.
All right.
So that I could grab this. Your Symphony of Selves from Jordan Gruber and James Fadiman. Jordan, welcome to the show.
It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to it. You have some great questions lined up. I took a preview, and I don't know that I can answer them all, but I'll do my best.
Well, I mean, it's really about how it's really about the journey by which we attempt to meet the challenge, than whether or not we accomplish it to the best, accomplish it to some sort of right or wrong measurement. Unless, of course, you're trying to make objective statements about objective data, in which case accuracy is obviously the most important element there. But so I read Your Symphony of Selves, and I really enjoyed it. A good portion of it was a lot of sort of background to this theory that you're presenting about multiple selves, and sort of like, I think in a way, my interpretation is legitimizing that, like, hey, we didn't just come up with this, and it wasn't just recently that it was come up with. It has existed in a number of different sort of domains of human history for quite a very long time. And it's only recently, in the last little while, that we're seeing this sort of dominance of a singular self model, what you called the single self assumption, and also exploring the model of healthy selves and how to work with them. And I was multiple times confronted with my own sort of like, I have a single self assumption. And even like looking at my book, Decomposing the Shadow, is like, it's all about the self. And then really wondering, okay, so what would I mean by that now? Or like, did I have it wrong? Or did I just have a misunderstanding about what I was actually talking about? Or what is it? So I found it both engaging and insightful and educational, and also confronting in a positive way. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you for being open to being confronted, because what we like to say is that the reason this is so hard for so many people to get a grasp around emotionally and cognitively is because they don't want a world without the certainty of either I have a single self or I can achieve a single self or I can at least, be in contact and it can guide me, or the very opposite, which we'll get to, that I have no selves and let's get rid of the whole idea completely. So people do find it very uncomfortable. And so, we think the reason this wasn't a runaway blockbuster, in addition to not being published by one of the big six publishing firms, is because usually when you bring up the idea of people having multiple selves, the initial gut reaction that everybody has is, oh, if I admit that, then people will think I'm crazy. So what we're saying is we're starting from such an overwhelming, and I did listen to my talk that I gave in November in the Integral Club before doing this today, but there's such an overwhelming linguistic and spiritual and psychological and religious. There's a lot of momentum going towards oneself. But if it's actually just an assumption, if like putting the sun at the center and you get rid of the epicycles, if you put multiple selves as who we are, if it explains enough, then it satisfies Occam's razor, and we can have a much easier way of getting to a lot of subjects that people get close to and then miss, ultimately, we feel.
So you said, what did you say there? Something about the single, oh no, sorry, I'm gapping. This happens to me sometimes. Single self assumption. I want to know more about the single self assumption, because in your book you sort of present, this is the question. Haha. Thank you, brain. So you had mentioned that most people would say, many selves, like, that might mean that I'm crazy. Okay. So part of that is the dominance of the single self-assumption, as you call it. And also a part of that is how out of that dominance, the sort of modern understanding of multiple selves came to be through how media explored the multiple personality phenomenon. So can you talk a little bit about how the way in which we approach the multiple personality pathology has sort of shaped the way we would sort of culturally by default assume that multiple selves would mean that there's something wrong with us?
Sure. Well, after Freud, and we can come back to him or any of the earlier history later, selves pretty much went underground everywhere except Sri Aurobindo and a couple of other places, Gurdjieff, for example, and psychosynthesis with Roberto Assagioli. But in general, the idea only surfaced again in the United States, at least, in the book and then the movie Three Faces of Eve. And then pretty soon we had Sybil, which had its own scandal where the person who wrote Sybil later on said that they conspired with each other and it was never a real thing. But the idea of not only that you could have different selves, but that necessarily means you're either crazy or in a horror movie, like something like Split or United States of Tara, which gets pretty weird. They're linked. So that's the only place in the book we quote my old friend Ken Wilber is about him helping us to disambiguate schizophrenia from multiple selves. They're different things. Schizophrenia is sort of a breakdown it's a biological breakdown. And yes, there is more incohesive selves and there is more ideation of voices, but that's very different than normal multiplicity like you and I have, where, I have my dad's self and I have I'm working with my client self and I'm hanging out with my old friend self. Those are all very distinct and you would know that those are different. So the problem has come that the idea of having more than one self equals in the logical mathematical mind of social parlance, it equals being crazy. There's no room really at all. Every now and then you see someone who's done things in a lot of fields and you go, well, how did you do, so many things? It's like when Jean Houston responded in an interview once, how do you do so many things? And her response to the interviewer was, how do you do so few? I have a part of me that loves classical music. And there's a part of me that loves rock and roll. And they're not the same part. They're not there at the same time. So, this idea that if you take a model where having selves is normal and you get people who would be diagnosed with multiple personality disorder or dissociative identity disorder, whose selves are not well associated with each other, who are not cohesive enough, and we ultimately use the criterion of cohesiveness. And we have this whole left, x-axis model that we can go through. But if you realize that most of us have a normal amount of cohesiveness, we remember most of the things that one of ourselves said to other people. We act in ways that don't freak out other people by switching too much in real time. That's kind of normal multiplicity. And the more you're aware of that, the more you can learn how to be in the right mind at the right time. One of the book's catchphrases, very easily, without learning a lot of lingo, without doing a lot of exercises. It's just an awareness that if I walk down that road into that self that always fights with, my friend about this one issue, and he's already in that part of who he is, we will have a fight. If you realize that, you don't have to do that. You can be more compassionate to the part of that other person who's tweaked out when you recognize they have these different parts and that they're not all the same. And some of them have different issues and some of them have different agendas, but they're all real, and figuring out how to, coherently have them all work together is really the goal here. But to say that having more than oneself in and of itself, funny term, makes you crazy, is just absolutely missing the picture. When I know that I have more than one self and learn how to shift into that, that's the exact, definition of sobriety and pragmatic effectiveness and authenticity for me.
Yeah, when you're talking about like the being in sort of, what's the term you said, cohesion or coherence?
Well, we have this x-axis, right?
Okay.
So you go from the left to the right, and this is someone has no cohesion between themselves. Then they have a good deal of cohesion. And in fact, they might even think they're a single self here. And then they keep moving and they realize they have these different selves, but they've learned how to work those together. So that's the cohesiveness axis. That in terms breaks down to coherence, congruence, and compassion. With coherence meaning that someone is understandable even though they're in and out of their different selves. And congruence means that they do what they're going to say, regardless of which one of their selves said it. And then the compassion is like a freebie. It just comes along. The more cohesive you are, the more you know you have these different selves, the easier it is to be compassionate to your own parts that are having a down day or doing something crazy, whatever they're doing, and the parts of other people that aren't doing what you want them to do or have done something very, very, very odd. And let me just give you an example. My mom is very sick. She'll probably pass in the next 2 or 3 months. I was out there last weekend. We postponed. She was talking to one of her best friends, but right before that, she was ideating in pain, pretty terrible pain. And her friend called, and she snapped right back into her most charming up conversational self, because she doesn't get to talk to Rosalie Moskowitz very often anymore. She's 92 and not doing that well. And it's, I could see her move into that different part. And it's like, it was a little bit off-putting and weird because right before she was moaning about how much it hurt and how terrible it was, and she was literally crying, and then she just shifted. But on the other hand, this is going to enable her to have a much more positive and powerful interaction with her long-term friend.
Yeah, just as a quick aside, and I think you speak about this into the book, but there's a good track record for people who are otherwise entirely debilitated by Alzheimer's, being able to listen to music from their childhood and know the words and get into it, and sometimes even be substantially more coherent for a period of time after listening to the music. Is that kind of the same sort of phenomenon that you're speaking to here?
Well, sure. And, we talk about, I'm forgetting her name right now. There's a social scientist who did this experiment where she took a bunch of older guys back to a camp environment, and they were 70, and she made it appear as if it was 19. I'll think of her. Her name will pop in a minute. And she had the music and Life magazine, and eventually these guys were very not functional when they started. And by the end of the week of pretending they were that much younger, they were all doing a lot better. And similarly, I think I talk about in the book, I have these Taekwondo kicks that I've been doing since I was 20. It was taught by this famous world-class guy who's still alive, all this stuff. But I do those, and when I do them, my hips think they're a lot younger. Once I do it a couple of days in a row, I can get my foot over my head again. It's like I move back into that younger part. Or I had a bike accident 5 years ago, head over heels. I didn't get on my bike for a few years. Then I thought, no, I love biking. And the moment I got back on, I was back into the 5-year-old self that learned to ride a bike. That had my dad holding it and my sister holding this, and they let go. And I was so excited and so revivified to be back in that part of who I was. And as a general principle, if you have parts of you that you lock away or you banish, you think you'll never hear from again, because they've been in trouble or it's too much. When you let them out and you give them a little bit of the light, the spotlight, you let them drive, whatever metaphor, they're usually so happy and grateful. You feel great and they do great work. And it's like, so I let the part of me that likes to sing out whenever I can now, because I know I have a pretty good voice and I really enjoy it. And I don't really care about what other people think, because that part needs to be nourished. And that means singing with and for other people. So it's like really taking the different parts of you that you actually have, that you move in and out of every day. I mean, I don't know you personally, but if I did know you, I bet you within a few weeks, I would be able to kind of with you map out which of these different, major parts you're in right now. It's, so I would say I really have been living this book ever since. I mean, we started writing it in 2015 and I had been thinking about these things for a while before, and Jin been thinking about it for decades before. So it seems just, obviously true. And I don't want to be on I listen back to my talk and it's like, yeah, we're going to change the world and a beautiful, it's like, okay, it's not that big a deal. And yet in some of the clubhouse rooms I'm in, I'm at the point now when people say self and they'll come back and correct it because I'm in the room. It's like, oh, we're having some effect, we're like we're opening the idea. The camel's nose is under the tent. And again, you can test this and verify all of this for free. And you don't have to learn very much because we do not. Jim is fond of saying we don't have a theory. We have about 6 suppositions or premises. We lay them out in the beginning. We repeat them later on. If you have a theory, if you have a full-fledged theory, you have to spend a lot of time defending it, and we're not interested in that. We're just saying all you need to do is get that you have different selves. You can name them or not, but, once you get that these selves are real, you can begin to work with them more effectively all the time for the rest of your life. There's almost no going back. It's kind of a one-way membrane like that.
Hmm. Yeah, the being able to identify and sort of engage the sort of movement of my experiences and perceptions and reactions to the world from a framework of parts and from a framework of sort of like different parts being activated at different times has been incredibly helpful for me, especially with respect to dealing with some of the parts, reactions, perceptions that aren't really, they're not really serving my life in a great way. And there's a lot of sort of cleanup that tends to happen when they emerge in one way or another. Although, and I'll ask you a bit more about this later, because I still have, specifically because I work with more of an IFS framework of model, and there is sort of a self premise in all of that. But I don't want to ask you about that yet. I want to save that for later. First, I want to get a better idea about the single self assumption. And you said that the sort of Healthy Selves premise
model, yeah.
It
worldview.
it kind of got squashed at some point. You said was sort of like with Freud, right?
Yeah, with Freud.
So I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. Now, for people who actually want to hear the very in-depth history and timeline and all the people involved and everyone who brought forth different theories at different timeframes and how they interacted with each other, that's in your book. So no expectation that you're going to go too deep into that, because I think if people really want that thorough of a background, they're going to read your book, and ideally, like myself, they will really enjoy it. But specifically, I'm curious about sort of just generally what the sort of context was for Healthy Selves when Freud came in with this premise of the ego and the id and the superego, and sort of like really doubled down on like the single self assumption, and why it was that he doubled down so hard, because you speak about into your book that he actually started with more of a selves kind of premise rooted in the recognition of trauma, and then went away from that completely for a reason. So I'll just sort of like give that to you to give us whatever story around that you feel is relevant for us to know.
Yeah, I won't give the long version. I'll give the shorter version. The key figure to understand, the first key figure is a guy named Jean-Martin Charcot, the great Charcot, who revived a big Paris psychiatric hospital called Salpêtrière. And Charcot was friends with William James, who came to study with him, Alfred Binet of IQ fame test, who came to study with him, his great disciple Pierre Genet, who coined the term subconscious and dissociation, and studied with him. And then Freud came and he studied with him as well. In fact, Freud named his first child Jean-Martin Freud after Charcot. And Freud's very first publication with Joseph Breuer, which was termed Studies in Hysteria, was very much working with this model that people had selves that were split off by trauma and that there were ways of getting back to them. In fact, he explicitly, in his first ever publication, says that he thanks Genet, Pierre Genet, Charcot's disciple, and the two Benets, which is Alfred Binet, the IQ guy, and his cousin. It was philosopher Paul Genet was Pierre Genet's uncle. So he thanked all these guys explicitly for their work in this stuff. And in the story of Anna O, he's also working with selves. And these different people, including William James in America, and he had two great students, Boris Sidis and Morton Prince, a guy named Frederick H.W. Myers, who started the British Psychical Society. And all of these folks pretty much understood that people had different selves. And Genet's work with dissociation, some people say that he still pretty much covered everything we know about dissociation. We have a whole other question about that. So everything is going along fine until, and the momentum on this builds until 1906, when Pierre Genet is invited to Harvard University and gives 15 academic lectures, including a few on selves. Everybody was talking. Some people thought it only happened in clinical situations. Other people like Myers and James thought, we are a confederation of psychic entities. We do have these different parts, and that's the way it is. Then in 1897, Freud famously rejected the seduction hypothesis. The seduction hypothesis was that people were being naughty. People were having sex with people that weren't supposed to, not their wives, their maids. People were abusing other people. People were doing stuff with children, physical and sex, all that stuff. And Freud basically said, that's all made up. I don't want to deal with that. And Jim thinks it's in part because his clientele was the very peak of Vienna society. And nobody wanted to talk about this or admit this. So Freud said, I'm going to explain away the actuality of any of that having happened. We'll say none of that really happened. There was none of this naughtiness and this untoward Me Too behavior that would get you canceled in a nanosecond. Now, none of it was real, but I have this great theory with id, ego, and superego that explains why everybody thinks all this stuff is true. And in doing this, he got rid of hypnosis. He got rid of dissociation. He got rid of selves. He said it was all wrong and not worthy spending any time on. So by around 1910, when Freud had his tide was so huge. He had a nephew who was a great publicist. His ideas took the world. He became the preeminent figure in the world on this stuff. And he said it wasn't real and we should ignore it. And none of it is true. And that's really when selves went underground, only to pop up again with, the three faces of Eve and Sybil, other than, like I said, with people like Sri Aurobindo and the Mother and Gurdjieff and then Assagioli. And then later, we had voice dialogue, and later than that, Cam's IFS. And, so there have been people who have kept working with parts and cells all along. But as the whole premise being a reality, 1906 Harvard conference of 1897, Freud said no. And by 1910, it was dead. It was, as I like to say it, a meme non grata. It wasn't welcome anywhere. Anybody who brought that up was thought to be crazy or a fool, especially if they said it was true about them. So it went away for 100 years, basically. Until the late 1970s, when the smart progressive therapists began picking it up and began realizing, oh, these people are traumatized. Oh, we can get to the self that was traumatized and help heal it, and that'll make a big difference. So so it's not really 100 years. It's more like 60 years. It was dead. Except for the novels, which, became more and more sensationalized. And like When Rabbit Howls is the one where the woman has over 100 personalities, but it's really gripping, and you don't want to read the story that gave rise to the title, And then also the very famous, I'll stop now, the very famous book that happened called The Minds of Billy Milligan, where the guy who wrote Flowers for Algernon, Daniel Keyes, wrote this in-depth psychological police and criminal justice narrative about this one guy who had 23 personalities. And it was a scientific event. And you could really see how the cells, admittedly incohesive and some of them crazy, really shifted in and out. It's really a breakthrough work.
So not commenting on the sort of inclusion of the sort of the novels you were talking about and the movement towards these other parts models yet, I just want to sort of reiterate and make sort of a comment on how disturbing it was to learn that the the whole premise that Freud has, which is deeply integrated into how the sort of common person understands what their mind is, which is
how we speak.
Exactly.
The very way we speak. Right. You can't get rid of the word ego. It's always there.
Exactly. Yeah. Ego, or like, yeah, oh, that's just my ego. There's like this way of thinking, and even the singular self-assumption as it is, although there's some religious associations I'll ask you about afterwards. And that this existed as a way to protect the sort of, his friends, the elite, likely his funders, from being accused and sort of like, what's the word? Sort of, identified and publicly known as being abusers of the people who were his patients, who were these elite people's sort of daughters and stuff. To think about that, such a huge impact on all of how we understand ourselves and our mind and the world, being rooted in the cover-up of abusing children and sexual abuse, is like huge, but also now post Me Too makes perfect sense. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say there are a lot of people who have risen to defend Freud in the last 10 or 20 years, but I don't see how they can explain this away. I think, we think this is what happened. And this is not a history you read anywhere else. We kind of came up with this by looking at the documents and going back and translating things from Paris newspapers using Google and all that kind of stuff. So, yeah. And I'm glad you recognize what a watershed it is, that if we're something like correct and that everyone has different selves and can pragmatically at least benefit, and the whole thing got pushed aside in order to protect people, that is kind of crazy, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's it points out to me why like there's a book, I think it's called like we've had 100 years of psychoanalysis and we're only getting worse. Why traditional Freudian psychoanalysis doesn't seem to have even vastly remotely the kind of impact on sort of well-being and trauma healing that some of the more modern parts-oriented models seem to have.
Yeah, that was a book by James Hillman. I saw him give a lecture at that in a local bookstore. Cool. So, and James Hillman, of course, is a Jungian disciple, and he's in our history too because he goes two ways on selves. But yeah, you're exactly right. You really get it.
So with respect to Jung, again, I don't want to go too deep here, but I think it's important because, especially this is a psychedelic podcast, I'm going to ask you about psychedelics in a minute. The things that will be sort of like most salient in people's understanding of psychology and people who have contributed to how we understand psychology will be Freud because of the ego, dissolving the ego, breaking the ego, killing the ego, which I'll ask you about later. But of course, then also Jung, because the Jungian model of understanding is such a significant sort of has had such a significant impact in making sense of psychedelic experiences from here on the, modern Western mind front. So maybe you could just give us a little sort of premise of where Jung started to break the tide from Freud with respect to a singular self model or healthy selves models, and how archetypes, the premise of archetypes or autonomous complexes, sort of fits in with a shifting away from the single self-assumption without actually going all the way out of it.
Well, one interesting fact about Jung that we unearthed, was in a book, so it wasn't that hard to find, but was that he wrote his medical dissertation on his cousin's case of multiple personality. That was before he'd even met Freud. So it's not like Jung was unaware of these ideas. And then he met Freud, and I forget exactly when Jung broke with Freud, but I think it was after he rejected the seduction hypothesis. So Jung saw this going, and then Jung, of course, had a great break with Freud himself. As you know, that they had a famous break, and there was a psychic eruption of somebody saying Bosch, and there was this huge split in the cabinet in the next room at the same moment. They had this whole big thing. And then later on, Jung, of course, is most famous for his concept of archetypes, but he also talks a lot about autonomous complexes, which are sort of like split off. I think he uses the term fragments of the mind that sort of do their own thing. So we can understand archetypes as being like these universal patterns that everybody has access to, and that some people embody different archetypes in different ways. So in some, I have a bit of a warrior archetype, not a lot, but I have some of that. But the autonomous complexes are different. They're actually very similar when you read the word to use to what we're talking about as independent selves. But for Jung, these sort of all remain on the inside. So on the inside of people, based on their exact life circumstances and their upbringing, they would have certain autonomous complexes, which would then, go further in expressing the archetypes that were mostly influencing them. But he never really took it farther than that, and he never brought it back into sort of the external world or questioned the single self-assumption like somebody like James Hillman later on does that very explicitly. So Jung was aware of selves at the very beginning, and he saw what went on with Freud, and then he sort of brought it partly back by saying we have these archetypes, which are universal, and people influence people in different ways, and then people have these different autonomous archetypes, these different fragments of mind that seem to have their own embodied, sense of being that show up and over again and that do things, and you got to watch them because they're there. And I don't remember if it was actually Jung who used the beach ball metaphor, but it's something like that. But if you take a ball and beach ball in a pool, you try to hold it on the water, you can do it for a few seconds, maybe even half a minute if you really focus, but eventually it pops right back up. So Jung recognized that about parts of us that we didn't, treat or deal with or approach. And of course, this brings us also to the question of the shadow, but that's used in a lot of different ways also. But yeah, so he was aware of all these dynamics, but he partly broke with Freud on that. He certainly saw that Freud's whole, theory and its sexual fixation was more about Freud than about reality.
There's a lot of interesting sort of avenues with what you just said that we could explore, but I'm not going to explore because it's not what I want to give our time to.
Okay.
So I eventually want to start asking you more about, the parts model, the selves model, like what are selves? Are they real? These kinds of questions, and a little bit more about how this relates to psychedelic work and what it might suggest about even the nature of reality, if you're willing to go there with me.
Yeah, I like the nature of reality.
Well, I like the nature of my reality most of the time.
There you go.
But I have two more questions around this sort of single self-assumption thing. And one of which, again, because it has to do with things that would be relevant to people who are thinking about psychedelics and sort of who might be listening to this podcast or reading your book to get a better understanding with respect to psychedelics, or anyone listening who must have some level of interest in that, or else they wouldn't have tuned into my podcast.
That's right.
And that would be monotheistic religions and Buddhism. Monotheistic religions, because although there is a trend now of a lot of particularly young men in the psychedelic scene leaning back towards Christianity in a lot of ways, there's sort of, at least in my experience, there was a lot of sort of like breaking from traditional religion after psychedelic experiences, those traditional religions predominantly being monotheistic, because I'm thinking mostly in the Western world, and an inclining towards Buddhism, and continuously still Buddhism being a significant sort of like, we'll say, lexicon for understanding psychedelic experiences, and even a practice for a lot of people that use psychedelics. But with respect specifically to the monotheistic religions, you actually bring up, this is the quote from the book, I'll just read it. Where did the pervasive idea of oneself, the single self-assumption, come from? In part, the idea is rooted in the world's monotheistic religious traditions, end quote. So you present that the psychic and cultural dominance of monotheism, the single God assumption, may be behind the prevalence of the single self assumption as well. Can you unpack that a little bit for us before I ask you specifically about Buddhism?
Well, I certainly think it's linked. The first time I laid eyes on James Fadiman was in 1989 at Foster Gamble's Mind Center. And he was giving a talk about this very subject. That talk actually focused a lot on looking at the monotheistic assumption and then kind of breaking it down and going, well, look, in Christianity, it's really a trinity almost always. And, in Judaism, well, you have Kabbalah, which is a different type of parts, but you do have people talking about, in the book, I talked to two of my rabbis about this. My Shabbat self is different than my ordinary self. And some people don't even activate their Yehudi self, their Jewish self. They're just not interested. But by and large, if you see religion as having been a huge control mechanism for thousands of years, you can see why it would be attractive to present a single, simple model that, is all powerful and that can, back in the old days would handle the rain and the weather and healing all by itself just by, praying the right way and not, dissing the gods and not doing things you're not supposed to do. I mean, there is something attractive in us. There is a singular ascending current that wants to make everything just one. And that certainly in the West has been the way that the children of Abraham religions have all come down. Ultimately, there is one God, God is one, in nearly every prayer that we do at synagogue, one way or another, the unity and singularity of the Godhead is being presented. And I think that's had a huge amount of influence in this way. But even if that is true, it doesn't for us, and we'll get back to this XY thing and what Buddhists are doing, it doesn't change that you're dealing with ordinary selves most of the time that aren't in that divine space or being guided that, pragmatically speaking. So this is a book of observational pragmatic psychology. It's not a book of theory. I certainly, we don't have a metaphysics. Jim is even more reluctant than I am to make any definitive statements about anything. I'm willing to say that I think I have a soul. I'm good with that, but Jim wouldn't even go that far because he's an agnostic, I'm pretty sure. I have to ask him. So I think it just, I'm thinking back to when Terence McKenna was riffing and he said, what monogamy, monotony, and monotheism have in common is boredom. But they all, make it easier to control things, get money together, work with people, so it's simpler. It would be simpler and easier. And the principle of parsimony and Occam's razor is always out there. And we feel we've handled that. But, generally speaking, if we only had one self, fine. But the way we're defining selves, which, we have sort of a lineage starting with Charles Tart and before him, somebody else that goes, selves are self-states and self-states are recurring patterns of mind, body, chemistry, energy, perception, and behavior in a human being. I see myself, it's like, electron shells. You're either up here at this level or you're down here. I have these 5 or 6 different gears or selves that I'm mostly in most of the time in my ordinary life. Knowing that they're real and that the part of me that, really is extremely lazy and indulgent, you have no idea, is different than the part of me that is like a world-class writer and editor. They're both me, but I have to know which one to get to. And I'm not trusting God to put me in the right self. I'm trusting, when I'm in my writing self, I got to eat and exercise first. And for something like this, I take the time to go back and listen to what I previously said and have just a couple of diagrams and definitions because, I want to be as effective as I can be in a different model. So I think I'm kind of rambling.
Okay. So thank you for that exploration of like monotheism and single God assumption, single self assumption. I want to ask you again about oneness and multiplicity a little bit later when we get into psychedelics. There's one more thing I want to ask before asking you a little bit more about the Healthy Selves model. And that is about Buddhism. And you talk about Buddhism and how did I put it? Okay, actually, I'll just read the question as I scripted it because I think this will be easier for me to frame it, which is, can you give us a short rundown of how Buddhism and the no-self/interdependence concept relates and contrasts with both the single self assumption and the Healthy Selves model?
Well, I don't think I can answer that directly, but I can go back to this X and Y axis and this little thing about Jim Fadiman and Sam Harris. So we have this X axis over here, very incohesive selves. Fugues, you don't remember things, you do things that other parts of you know is wrong, very bad. You become more and more cohesive, and eventually you arrive here at this point where you might believe you're just a single self, but in any case, your selves are working a lot better and you're functioning really well. Eventually, you move all the way over to here, and you're aware that you and everyone in your life have selves, and you're actively, although not necessarily with a lot of effort, constantly shifting ahead of time rather than being switched or triggered into the wrong self. And you're being more compassionate to other people in your life who are in the self that annoys you the most, but you remember that's not all of who they are. That's the X-axis. What happened was Sam Harris said to Jim, well, what about, Buddhists who want to have 0 self? So I'm going to put that down here. And over here we have 1 self. So we have this y-axis where people either want to have zero selves, like in Buddhism is the ultimate goal, or in Taoism, just be in the flow, or a single self that either you identify with or you channel or become one with Christ, or you are completely follow Muhammad's laws perfectly, and you are with that one self, or it's your true self and your actual self and your new age high self, and you've become it. And so that's this axis, right? That's the y-axis.
Like
What
more
we're saying,
self on the top, less self on the bottom for people
yeah,
listening.
one self, one single self, zero selves for the Buddhists. And what we're saying again is this y-axis is just beyond our pay grade. But here's the thing. Even if you're somebody who is working hard to have the one self or to have zero selves, the farther you are along on this x-axis, the better off everyone in your life will be. And in fact, if you're farther along, you're less likely to, give up your whole life and join a monastery or become a beggar on the streets of Sri Lanka, which might do you a lot of good, one part of you, but probably not the other parts of you that have a life and enjoy it and have a family and responsibilities. So we're saying this is our domain, this x-axis work, this y-axis work of, one self up here, I've achieved the single self, and zero selves down here. That may or may not be real. It's spirituality. It's a different level of observation and work than, being with the selves that you actually have, and not, and we'll get to IFS probably later. We don't really like systems, ultimately, that still place a single self in the middle. And that includes your Gurdjieff and Sri Aurobindo and the Mother, and IFS, and voice dialogue, and almost all of them. That the idea is that somehow when you're doing better, it's because you've connected to the single self. And that the more you connect to the single self, the more you become it, the more enlightened you will. And we're going, yeah, but when things are really rough in your life, you don't usually have access to that single self or to the no self state. If you've been triggered, you're probably not in, when the Dalai Lama gets upset, he's not in the brilliant, no self bodhisattva part of him. He's in the part of him that gets cranky. This is true of everybody. So, recognizing that, yeah, you might want to put most of my life I devoted to trying to achieve the big bang orgasm of singular enlightenment. Believe me, I tried in so many ways, fasting and substances, and I had the website enlightenment.com and got to interview a lot of people. And, I realized eventually, partly through Heron Stone on Clubhouse, that I'm enlightened enough. This is about it for me, and it's pretty interesting and pretty good. And I have these different selves. The idea that I can have a Hail Mary to, the super God part of me whenever I need it. And that's the way to, construct my, ordinary day-to-day living systems and my therapeutic systems, again, seems to be a misplacement of how human beings are actually constructed and go through their day-to-day lives. The self that you're in that gets really upset or worried or has anxiety or has difficulty dealing with the situation, you need to learn to work with that part of you when it's in the driver's seat, rather than hoping that somehow the clear, true light of brilliant, radiant mind will dissolve it and you'll know what you're supposed to do in real world instantly. That's, for us more of a fantasy or something that, maybe people evolve into, and they do have higher levels of awareness that are always present. There are certainly people who present like that in Clubhouse and other places, but I haven't known that many. I've known some very interesting people and people who thought they were enlightened and seemed to be different levels of the mountain. And, I never got to meet some of the people who, when I was in my 20s and 30s, I really thought I could just be with them. I could just be with Dafri John. If I could just be with, Rajneesh. I actually went to Rajneeshpuram in Oregon for 3 days to see if that might work out. If I just fast long enough and take enough LSD right after, without, and contain it, I'll be enlightened. I'll have that single high self. It'll always be here. And I've given it up. I think it's childish and partly an artifact of the single self assumption.
So I think that in the sort of what you just shared, there's a lot of sort of proposition. There's your framing of your sense of where single self comes in, even in parts models and spirituality and et cetera. And in that sort of a bunch of propositions made that may or may not fit with one or other of the systems that you spoke to while you were sort of presenting that. Some of that we might unpack later. maybe not. But I'm curious about this question. This is something that I was thinking about and something I explicitly thought about when reading your book about no self. And you're thinking about, you said that you have that, was it y-axis, up and down? Very top, oneself. Very bottom, no self, we'll say, right?
Or selves, right.
Right. So one thing that I have been wondering is, okay, so is it possible from a healthy selves model, as well as a sort of like a selves model in general, because it's not always healthy, that as an adaptation to us not liking who we are or how we've acted, or et cetera, our adoption of particular spiritual paradigms, et cetera, that we might sort of take on a no self, like really extremely, as a way that itself is a sort of adaptive compensation for not wanting to accept all the parts that were a part of what we thought were the one self that we're denying is real, wherein the no self becomes its own kind of singular self, a single self assumption, but it's like the single no self assumption. And that no self becomes a sort of, compensation and adaptation to avoid the consequences of having to look at all the other parts of what we were once conceiving of as ourself, like a big pendulum swing. How do you feel about that?
Oh, it's really interesting. I've never heard that phrased that way. I mean, I know that I started meditating this year, really, in a consistent way, and I never have before. And when I move into the space of meditation, it's very much about giving up all of myself and not having to have one of them kind of take over, and usually then wants to get up and do something, or wants to claim that we didn't set the timer, or, all these different things that happen, and just kind of be in that sense of not being in any particular self. The idea of creating new selves is another interesting idea. Some people believe that you can create new selves consciously. Other people think that they sort of happen to you, usually through bad things that have happened. Although we bring up in the book, like me having a bike riding self form when I was 6, that was a good thing. Or a floating in the ocean self. I remember when I was 4 and that one came into being. But the idea that you could consciously create a new self to kind of give you leverage on all of the other selves. But I don't know why you would kind of create a self that would in turn disavow the other parts of you that are real. I mean, we're going back to our definitions. One of our first premises is that selves are real. So, what does the word real mean? In a lot of discourse, it means race, and it's a thing, and it means extended. But we're saying real in that it's a hard fact of reality. And even though we don't know where they come from and we can't really explain them, all that, they're there. And we say that they have innate value from the start. Yourselves are an innate part of who you are, and that's a good thing. It's almost like an original blessing view. And that they often have different agendas that you can't control. I like to throw in that they often have different entelechies. Of course, with the entelechy of an acorn to become an oak, to use that Aristotelian term. So yourselves are these kind of, some of them may be a hot mess. Some of them, may be unable to cope. But it would seem like a whole other level of unnecessary effort to create another self that was going to specialize in learning how to ignore these different selves, especially the ones we don't like, or do things that we don't want to do. I mean, I would think that would be the road to madness. Maybe not.
Yeah, I mean, I just wonder about it, particularly in conversations, and particularly when it seems as though the sort of minimization of there being a me of any substantial impact or substance at all, which is presented as a no self theory, is used as a way of sort of like making sure that that any part of the self is never really seen or acknowledged, or like efforts to utilize narrative speaking that never sort of creates any type of ownership over any movement of mind that emerges through a person, with no self, there being no self on Buddhist concepts as a sort of like explanation for why that's a thing, and wondering about if that itself could be a kind of dissociative, or not dissociative, a sort of defensive compensational model in the same way.
Right. That's one of the troubles people get into when they're doing too much y-axis stuff. Like, I've known some Buddhists who did things like got divorced and other things, who were a terrible mess in the real world. all of that stuff didn't apply when they were like fighting over property. And, it's religion is its own sphere and spirituality is its own sphere. This is sort of the place where, I'm thinking now of Brian and Hestia Kaplan, who run a room in Clubhouse called Epiphanies Through Humor, and we're very much in alignment. And what they do is, with a twinkle in the eye and a smile in the heart, they give people crazy, absurd, funny feedback of whatever their issue is. And the goal is to get if they have a self that is over dominating and over controlling the situation, to kind of get it to relax and laugh at itself. But so they're working with selves not by trying to get rid of them or banish them, but by shining a different kind of light on them so that they'll play better with the whole system of who you are. So in this sense, I think we always want more of this kind of light rather than less of it, because the parts of who we are, some of them may be pre-verbal. I also have this thing about, you don't just have an inner child, this archetype of the wise, fun, laughing, often sometimes abused part of you. It's like you have different inner selves that might be children. Some might be pre-verbal. I have a very young female self that I found in my men's group, of all places, right? And I have a couple of more like teenage boy selves, and I have selves of different sexes that are different ages and different capacities. But when I feel their overall pattern, their kind of signature gestalt, and I know I'm in one of those, I try to be at least a bit aware of that and keep some of my attention on the other parts of who I am. And that's where practices like centering or creating a grounded, centered presence, come in really handy without necessarily having to make it. You were asking questions that I didn't know how to answer about centering. And if you're centering in who you are, aren't you? It's not necessarily one thing that's doing the centering. And then the response is no. It's a symphony. It's this jazz band. It's this flock of birds. It's there's so many metaphors for how different parts can work together. But we generally have a hard time of thinking of any of these in real time, because when we're in a self and it feels, unhappy or it's been slighted or whatever, it's really easy to feed into that self, whatever it is, and make things worse. And I think just, a big part of being adult, which at 62, I'm still not very far into, I feel, is just recognizing that usually saying that one more thing that I know is going to catch fire with the other person, it feels like it's going to be a good move in real time, and it usually isn't. Yeah, that kind of personality may work when you're at the airline ticket booth and you're about to miss your flight and be doomed, and you get a little bit crazy, because that kind of crazy self gets responded to. But you can't have that self, guiding the show the rest of the time, or things aren't going to work out well.
Okay, so there's a number of things. One, thank you for fielding my question about the no self. It's something I've been wondering about. It's not something that I've concluded upon. The other thing you were speaking, I was going to ask you more about the Healthy Selves model, but I feel like that has been, like, you've done really well to flush that out as we've been talking. So I don't think I need to specifically ask you about like the selves model now, because it's I feel like it's clear for anyone who's been listening. And there was another comment that you just made about working with different selves and about centering. I love the premise that you presented in the book. Like, okay, so if there's no singular self that's sort of leading the show, like, how does it move? Like, how does it switch between who's in the lead? And you use the example of flocking birds. Mm-hmm. And I just thought that was great. It made the premise very accessible to me without holding a sort of like central conductor, a sort of premise to create the symphony. But you had also just made a comment just there at the end about centering, about coming into sort of doing a centering thing. Now you're not, this isn't a sort of like a making a super self. You explicitly say like, that's not where you're speaking to, but some sort of action that centers, right?
Right.
And what I'm curious about is, even as, okay, so centering into what? Like centering into, when we're centered, we're centering into what, right? When we're in that centered place. And another question is like, so who's doing the centering? And another question is, who are you inviting to do the centering and to pay attention to the multiple selves when you're bringing this up?
This reminds me of that time I was on ayahuasca. I feel like I'm in my Peter Griffin stuff when I go into sort of this time I was on ayahuasca, and I watched myself watching myself, and then I watched myself watching myself watching myself. I went to 11. I was counting. I could go up to 11 levels of watching myself watch myself, and then I realized like it's turtles all the way down, to use the that old metaphor, and which Wilbur uses too. It's like at a certain level, I don't know how to answer this, but let me speak a little bit about the conductor thing. When we use the term symphony of selves, which is a term I literally channeled into my chair after I, smoked a little bit and sat with my type, and it came, and I knew that was the right title. The problem is that after about 1700, symphonies usually had a conductor. There was one single people. So other people said, well, that's a bad metaphor then. And I went, well, okay, except we have jazz bands and a lot of, symphonies, they lead themselves and they take turns. But then I thought a little bit harder, and it's like the conductor is my body. It's a conductor of life force, karmic energy, all sorts of things that we could list out. That's literally conducting the life energy through me. And so I'm asking the different selves to come in. Often movement helps, but sometimes silence helps. I'm a big moving guy. I'm a moving centered personality, which means I often don't know what I'm thinking until I'm moving, which is why I bounce and walk a lot. I'm inviting to come into this. It does feel like a space or presence in me. I don't know if that's real or true, but that's, I think, the best words can do with it, and just invite them to sort of, all the different parts that are relevant to be present with each other. It's kind of like if you watch The Big Bang Theory, they have an episode they have it's Sheldon has 7 different selves, and it's presented like an Arthurian round table, and they very explicitly call out the concept. So I don't know if it's that explicit, because I tend to shy away from giving myself name and knowing exactly how many there are, and all the sort of, and certainly nowhere near that things. There's firefighters and there's exiles. I mean, we don't work with any of that terminology, because for most people, it just tends to make it more complicated. It's more that for me, I can feel when I'm centered, because all of the parts of me are sort of, they're closer in. There's some of the analogies we use are like it's a boarding house, and there's different floors that people live, but sometimes on the bottom floor there's a big room where everybody kind of gathers and hangs out. So that's kind of like the best metaphor I can give for that. Just like I think that, like I said, I feel like I have a soul. I think that's a good term, and my soul is sort of an autopoietic evolutionary dynamic. It's sort of a whirlpool that brings all sorts of influences, physical and metaphysical, into my body. And we keep moving through everything, including the different selves that are part of us. And then some kind of go away and new ones maybe come. So I see that as, maybe what's pulling it together and centering. But, once again, this is the kind of thing where I don't think we, like in the book, a couple of times we have like this whole chapter and say, here's all the theories about where selves come from, biological and cellular and karmic and adults who are speaking to you and all these things. And then we go, and none of that matters really at all. What really matters is that, the next time you're at Thanksgiving and Uncle Abner, who's, is into QAnon at this point, brings it up and wants to have a fight, you don't go to that part of you that has a fight with him. You just let him be who he is, and pretty soon that part of him will kind of move on if it doesn't get a lot of attention in the whole group. It's very much more a pragmatic thing, I think.
Yeah, I mean, from a pragmatic perspective, that does make sense. The sort of like not worrying too much about all these different definitions and all, et cetera. For someone like myself, those definitions and those theories and those models and the conceptions and how they all work and interrelate is
you like this stuff.
Very important to me. Evidently, as here we are in this conversation, right?
Yeah, you have fun with this kind of stuff, and I appreciate the level of nuance that you're trying to come to and draw out with it.
And with that, so here's 2 things that I observed. One, you regularly said I as you were talking about the centering. And so who is this I that centers? And 2, you mentioned, if those are 3 things. 2, you mentioned the body as the conductor. Well, the body isn't a singular thing either. Like
not even close.
The organs they're all functioning in systems. So are the cells.
Right, it deconstructs itself. Like, most of our cells aren't human, even though our human cells outweigh the non-human ones. Most of us isn't even human on that level.
Totally.
So, when I gave my big talk, in November, my 54-minute talk on selves in the integral room, I very consciously used we. I didn't use I once, or maybe once. And it was really hard. And when I just listened to it again, both at regular and fast speed, it sounded weird. And we think that this is, I'll try to go to this part. We think that Heron Stone is right, that the word I is just one of those linguistic conventions that you can't really pin down, that everybody uses all the time because we do it. And if we don't do it, it sounds weird. But, we believe that it's hard to do it even for a minute and keep a straight face. But, there's advantages. We talk about in the book that if you talk about yourself as we, or if I talk about myself as Jordan or the Jordans, and sometimes when Jim and I do emails back to each other, we'll explicitly talk about which part we're writing from. Those parts of me, I just lost track. Damn.
We.
Yeah.
You were talking about we instead of I.
We really feel that, when you talk out loud in the third person, other than the first person, you do better in executing things and memory and how you feel. And there's a lot of research out there, at least 3 or 4 studies, I was going to call that a lot, that say that talking to yourself in other than first person is more effective for a whole lot of things. Maybe because it just wakes you up to the simple premise that there's really a we going on here. But it's very easy to move back into I. It's hard to not move back into I. We did some rooms where we tried to go more than a minute without people using the word I, and it was almost impossible. And, I think that just speaks again to the saliency of the single self assumption. It's built into the way we talk and process. It's even hard to take what we're talking about seriously because even we can't keep to we. And I've been focused on this for 7 years now, and it's very hard to not want to go I. So is it just a convenience? Is it, maybe all what we're saying is completely wrong. And in the end, we'll find out that there is only a single us. And, there'll be proof that everyone has a single frequency and that's who they are or something like that. But, again, pragmatically, if you can remember even a little bit of the time, especially when you're heating up, especially when you're on that precipice of going from I could still proactively shift into a different self to I've been switched or triggered and, come hell or high water, this is who I am and I'm going to deal with this now. You don't want to get there. You want to have more flexibility. I mean, if you want to go into that self and go for it full-fledged and you need it, sometimes you need to. But most of the time, you're better off holding on to the flexibility of sort of this, I want to say communal or communitarian way of being with the other parts of who you are. Acknowledging they all have a place, acknowledging that even the ones that are the most problematic aren't bad, aren't wrong. This idea of no bad selves. Just because you have selves that don't do what the rest of you want to do, if you make them really wrong, if you give them like I was labeling myself as being Larry the loser, I would lose pocket knives and vape pens, both very difficult things to hold on to. And Jim was like, I don't think you should call yourself the loser. That if you were that part, would you want to be called that? And it's like, oh, so there's a little bit of golden rule or platinum rule. The platinum rule. The golden rule is do unto others as they would have you do unto them. The platinum rule is do unto others as they would have you do unto them. The platinum rule involves a little bit of at least empathy, if not telepathy, and people are reluctant to want to do that. But if you kind of figure out how you can work with these parts that are the most difficult, like in the book, we have a letter Jim writes to someone who has a serious porn addiction, 10, 12, 14 hours a day. He's like, well, first of all, don't label it wrong. And ask it if it's willing to go down to 1 or 2 hours a day to start, rather than I'm going to get in, whatever the anonymous is, and I'm going to do this and do that. And, that doesn't work. Although there is this whole point we make about Alcoholics Anonymous. The reason it works so well compared to most forms of therapy is when you go into an AA meeting, one of the first things you say is, my name is Jordan Gruber and I'm an alcoholic, which I'm not. But that's what you would say. And when you bring that part of you, the part that is trouble, the part that needs help, the part that other people have brought that part of themselves in with no shame, then you can really work with that part of who you are. And that's why we think Alcoholics Anonymous is so very effective.
So, I mean, the reason I pointed at the I language was more like I really appreciated your sort of deconstruction of that. And I don't want you to feel pressured to use we from here on in because it is quite cumbersome. And pragmatically, I just works very well, and I understand that who collectively or individually you're pointing to when you say I. And but the reason I brought it up too is like there's still this like the who is doing the switching, the who are we talking to, like who is the one that's and then you don't have to answer that question, but that's still a wondering that I had as I was reading.
We're back to questions like free will. I mean, I was in a room with Ajax the other day. This guy, he was deconstructing. No matter anything you could say to him was proof that you didn't have free will. So I don't know who that I is that ultimately is running the show. I mean, I'm personally a panentheist. I believe the divine is interpenetrated throughout all matter, but also transcends it. And I think I do believe there is a single divine mind, and I'm fine with that because that's not yourself. You may participate in that on a 400 micrograms of acid. You might experience yourself as being ultimately that, but when you come back down into your ordinary set of selves, having a glimpse of that is useful and can orient you, but it's not where you live from. Nobody can live from that part of who they are.
I would say I disagree only like on the sort of grosser level of what you just said, as it gross as in granularity, which is like you can't live from that self. I agree very on the more specific end of like, no, if everyone was just living as like the expression of the total Godhead, there is no end. I mean, like maybe that's where we go when we die or something, but it's like the fact that I am a me alive interacting as a human, et cetera, means that I am biologically in this reality unable to be that self at all times. But this kind of goes back to IFS, and especially the way I'm interpreting it increasingly over time. Your book actually was assisting in that, is the shifting of language. Then this is not me necessarily, from the self to self energy, connecting with yourself to connecting with self energy. Because in that sense, and here's my disagreement, I do think it's possible to live your life connected with that self at all times, or most times, because there is some element of me, James, that is an expression of James's expression of being that or embodying that to whatever small amount is available in baseline consciousness. And when connected with self energy, how it expresses is the kind of, I think, coherence or cohesion that you're speaking to, and the centering. And this is where I look at IFS is like, you get to the place where, yes, you sort of spoke about the firefighters and all that, you get to the place where the primary disposition from which you're engaging this inner world of parts is a disposition that is connected enough with that energy that it's able to be like, yeah, I just feel whole now. I just feel like I'm me now. You're in the cohesive place. And from there, connected with self energy, which is being in the conduit to maybe this larger reality self that you're speaking to, the transcendent, you can bring this compassion, courage, confidence, and you can help all these other selves sort of heal and come back in and sort of be reintegrated without being shoved away, repressed, or forced integration back into the cohesion that is being connected with self energy, or held by self energy as the sort of centering place from which the selves express into the world. Which is why, even as I was reading your book, you were like, speaking to a few things with IFS, I was like, oh, I think it's so much more capable than the way that you're framing it with respect to the very model that you're presenting, sort of assisting and complementary to your model too.
So I like how you put all that. I don't think I'm in disagreement, but I'll say a few things about it. One is, again, self-energy, having sort of like being able to feel the divine spark in you at any moment. Certainly we have access to that, but again, that's not a self. That's maybe it's a conduit to ultimate truth and reality, or our problem with it is when it begins to be over relied on as a lifeline. And in fact, the very definition of what's good about selves, as I read some of IFS, at least the early stuff, is that it, the work gets you in contact with your essential self. And when you're feeling good, that means by definition, you're in contact with your essential self. But all of that kind of takes the focus away from working with the selves you have as they actually are in real time. It's a definitional problem. It's my different selves are good and innately good, not because they're participating in the ultimate reality and single self, which you might argue they also are, but because, they are what they are. When Nietzsche talked about how first the Jews and then the Christians following the Jews, I'm Jewish, the Jews made their definition of good to be, we're not like those people who have oppressed us. We're not like all those bad, negative people who oppressed us. And then the Christians did another turn on that, the way he describes it. But the point is that it's not a sui generis definition of positivity and essential divinity of myself the way they are. They become good because they then hook up with this essential self or higher current, or that somehow heals them or cures them or enables them to do what and we're going, it's a religious and spiritual view. It's just not psychology, and it's not empowering of yourselves the way they are in their concrete reality, the way one you're in right now is listening to me say that, you know what, once you hook up with that divine essential self, you're going to be okay. And if you have any real problems, that's where you go. We're saying, no, you're okay the way you are now. When problems come up, you're going to work with you and the other selves you have and work with them now, rather than pushing it all off one level more to this metaphysical concept. So, but personally, I do like the idea of it's like Matthew Fox with Original Blessing. What's your basic view of the essential humanity of, or the cat sitting here? What are they? Are they good? Are they? And I don't think we need this additional postulate of an essential self to be able to go there.
Yeah. And, again, I think maybe you would find some curiosity in seeing where Schwartz and his work has gone now in the more recent stuff, if you've only sort of deep dived the earlier things. But even speaking about like the idea of there being this essential self, I'm definitely guilty of speaking to that, like presenting that earlier on in my career in the form of the true self. But what I'm speaking to is more that there is a larger force of being. If you were to hold all of reality that exists, all of everything, material and immaterial, as a singular whole, as a state of connection with a capital C or of love with a capital L, that is sort of what feeds all life. And it is possible to be in a disposition within ourselves where we are feeling connected, we're feeling with love. It's that same feeling an infant has when they're being held in good attunement by their parents and their loved ones. And I genuinely believe that it is through attunement with the parent in the neurobiological development of us from young that we actually tune our brains to be able to connect with this sort of like force of being in the world. And it's when we can sort of reconnect with that force of being within ourselves, which exists beyond us as well. From that place, we can act with compassion. We can act with care. And from there, we can start acting with compassion and care to the parts that might be activated at times, the ones that we would otherwise want to attack and want to label as bad and want to do all this. And from that place, we can actually hear them for why they're not bad. And we can see them in this act. They're like, oh yeah, like I actually see why you're caring for that thing. And I appreciate that. And you can see them and there are no bad parts. Every one of them is serving a positive intention. It's just that the consequences of how they're acting on that intention due to how they learned to do it at the time in which they sort of came to be by some negative experience or et cetera, is not actually giving the results that it's hoping for broad scale, just myopically in this sort of contorted rational perception of reality that it engenders when it's triggered. And that's what I'm speaking to more so than an essential self.
Sure. So it's a both and. And you have a strong religious, linking and psychedelic, energy. And I like it. And I'm generally, with it. But it's just that we're inherently, I'm speaking for Jim and I now, suspicious of any systems that start out by dissing yourselves. And if you look at the earlier stuff, right, they talk about selves sometimes as degraded reflections of the essential self. So, yeah, he had to write a book called No Bad Selves because for 20 or 30 years, the premise was that unless you were being in contact with the essential self, then you were missing something important and holy that would save you. And we're just saying that's another whole level. And it's also involved with a complicated system that does trainings and makes money and does all these things. And a lot of people don't need that to be able to work with the idea that they're selves. But sure, if you can, show the divine light people through your heart and your actions, and they can get that there is a divine hologram or fractal of who all we are, or the sparks from Kabbalah, or however it works, my divine interpenetration of the being pantheist. If you can feel and work with that, fine. But a lot of problems have come out from that too. People get, over involved in religious cults. People do so much that they, in these kind of realms, that they lose their ordinary life stream. And so, we're saying again, if you realize that you have these different selves on this x-axis, and you're also doing that kind of work, you're somehow becoming a better person by hanging out with somebody who really is holy and really does treat people with uniform kindness, or has made a great nonprofit that saved the lives of thousands of people, or somebody like Wilbur who's illuminated millions of minds, millions through his maps. That's great, but that's not psychology. It's psycho-spirituality. It's spirituality and religion. And that's, my basis, generally speaking. But because the single self assumption has been so strong for so long, these systems that ultimately peg it back on a single self, or like in so many clubhouse rooms where it's your essential self, it's your high self, it's your one self, it's your authentic self. And you just hear the way people use these words, and it would be, there's null semantic content. They're almost never really advancing, Pauls. They're just tautologically redefining things in terms of other things that everybody knows is good, and that you have this thing, and we're going, it doesn't matter if you have this high holy self. You might get to be with it sometimes. I mean, that's one of the reasons I'm, a psychonaut, right? It's great. But the ordinary day-to-day life, the core-based psychological and physical reality of living a happy and fully engaged and fulfilled life doesn't start with, oh, the great self will heal me. It starts with, these are my selves in the world that I've already got. I've got a self that overreacts. I've got a self that every now and then drives like an idiot. I've got these parts of me, and I gotta work with those. And that's our job. I'm back to the R, not my. That really is our job, is to recognize that, when you do like this, the rest of them, it's that notion of shoulder angels we talk about in the book, which is actually a Muslim concept. It's where like you have shoulder committees, right? You have different cells that say, we can get away with this. Listen, and then you have the part of you that goes, no, you really need to go see your mother, and you need to go see her now, because there's things that only you can do. You got to go. We don't want to go. You got to go. And it's like that kind of level inside of me is where I come from. Not I must go because God wanted, or I'll be holier, or I'll be more true to my authentic being. It's more like, what are my real world needs and desires and draws and responsibilities, and how do I feel about my mom, and it's like none of that gets, it is the spiritual, but it's not, by name the spiritual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One comment you said, you were like, our work or something like that. Our job is to do this. And you meant like our as in the inner me, the inner multiplicity that is me,
we,
right? But when you said that, I also thought, and also, like we're integrated into larger webs of relationship, and we can't actually do this alone. That's just a comment aside. The other comment was just thanking you for letting me say my statement before, because it felt great and felt like probably the most coherent way I've said it ever. So
that was good. That should be the basis of a chapter in a book. That's a good model. And maybe, part of your job is to help bring cells together in a way that's even more, that because, you presenting a possibility of a greater both and synthesis without, maybe I'm a little bit more on like the attack side, because early on in Your Symphony of Selves, we were getting people from IFS accusing me of plagiarism and saying there was absolutely nothing new in what we'd done. And that's crazy. You just have to read our book. Most IFS people would gain a lot from reading our book, even though we have a disagreement about placing an essential self in the middle of a system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I have put the idea that I gave to you into my Zettelkasten at one point, but I might actually transcribe how I said it to you because it might fit better in perspective for writing it down, chapter in a book or
No, I
whatever.
thought that was good because you
Yeah.
had 188, you had one iteration of it in the questions you sent me,
Yep.
and then you came back with it again, and it was pretty clear. I like it.
Yeah, thank you. The other comment was feeling as though as you responded, I felt like there was sort of an invocation of a sort of like model for the sort of like a more extreme version of what I was talking about. That actually what you were saying in response and debate to this sort of extreme, like trying to be your essential self and all the rest. What you were saying in response to that was actually more what I was speaking to, that this sort of connection with that self energy, that sort of conduit that I spoke about, that going into that extreme, like the monkhood and all the rest, that's actually a whole other thing. That what I mean by being in that is being in the most like basic level of human connection, where like optimal flourishing can exist in connection with each other and with whatever relationship that you're in, something like being in the right mind at the right time, but not necessarily a kind of like spiritual ascension, but it's more like a sort of like very basic human embodiment of being together as human in the day-to-day reality of what it is to just try to get along in the world when we're all complex and in many ways all traumatized people due to the way the world is that we were brought up into. And also agreeing with a lot of your sort of like your protest to the framing that you brought in about sort of the way things are talked about. Would you call it like a tautological repetition and like verbal?
I mean, if you just have to go into any essential self, it's and the way
I
it's
agree.
people are
Yeah.
always, and the way people will get quiet and talk about myself, yourself, and I have to. It's like, yeah, but let's just unpack that and make it. If we had this idea from the beginning that you have these different, for kids it could be you have your play self and your work self and your study self and your TV self. I mean, I don't know if that would work, but just it's going to be 100 years before this idea changes and before the single self assumption really is questioned in language and religion and philosophy. We're just kind of it's been out for 100 years. We're just trying to bring it back and in a more direct way than just by working with parts like IFS and voice dialogue and all those guys.
And to me, I actually feel like it what I'm speaking to is very similar to what you were kind of speaking to just a moment ago, about like wanting to go to this ultimate enlightenment and like feeling that there is a hole there, but then, like recognizing that, maybe it actually doesn't serve you to be trying to get there, but also all of reality is some expression of the multiplicity of that whole. And in some sense, our sense of being a whole me, that is an expression of a multiplicity of selves and literal physical parts and molecules, is sort of like a fractal iteration of all of reality downwards. And even in how we interact with each other itself being many selves into sort of a larger mind. And I feel like what I got out of your like Symphony of Selves book was really in service in helping me better understand how to frame that, because it gave me an opportunity to start really critically analyzing, okay, single self assumption, those are some really that's a very valid argument you're making against this thing. How can I utilize your argument as a lens to look back and see, like, where am I holding a single self assumption in a way that might be clouding my ability to get a better understanding of my selves and how to live a happy, healthy, beautiful life with the people I care about and do what I hope to be more good onto the world than otherwise in my time that I'm here. So thank you for the book, is what I'm saying.
Well, you're welcome. And when you were speaking, I was thinking, when we have Wilbur's idea of holons within a holons, right?
Yeah.
But it's more complicated than that. And I think intersectionality, which is more of an academic framework about identity and selves, that you really can't understand somebody until you understand all of these different life arcs and how they get there. So it's sort of like, fractal or holographic reflections on many dimensions all at once. Here, we're actually incredibly complicated all the way down to the 70 trillion cells we have, give or take. And each one of them is just a whole incredibly complex society. And then you get down into the mitochondria, which are, themselves, again, this whole incredibly, did you ever read the Wind in the Door trilogy with Charles Wallace and Madeline L'Engle? She has this character turning very small, like in Fantastic Voyage, and he's inside his own mitochondria where he's very sick. And it's just really evocative to think of, we get so confused by the scale we're on and think this is all that's going on. when you look at some of those things about, to the Planck length all the way up, there's like vast orders of magnitudes where we have no idea what's going on at that level. And we present it as nothing's going on until you get this. And it's like, but we don't, it's not like in, the movie with Tommy Lee G and the aliens and
Men in Black.
Men in Black. Right. At one point, they pull out a whole galaxy, and so the whole galaxy, and the other guy goes, "Yeah, humans have no idea about scale and how big things really are or aren't." We're really convinced that this is the only level of scale that matters, and
right. There's a whole galaxy inside a marble that was inside whole galaxy that was inside a locker, and then there's another one that's inside okay.
Russian dolls all the way down.
So let's okay, with the time frame we got left, let's move towards psychedelics. You've mentioned a number of times, like LSD, using LSD, or like in your history, right? Jim Fadiman is one of the authors on this book. He's obviously very well known for his work in the psychedelic field, or at least I should expect anyone who cares about the psychedelic field to have Jim in their mind as someone who should be well known. So let's go into psychedelics with respect to this Healthy Selves model, and where you see psychedelics, where you see it in all of this. Okay, maybe in therapy, but I mean specifically in general with respect to what the psychedelic experience sort of might introduce us to that gives way or serves or doesn't serve understanding this Healthy Selves model.
Well, based on my experience, I would say that generally speaking, at least at low doses of psychedelics, tryptamines, I am more aware of the different selves and which self I'm moving into and out of. I think when you get to higher doses, sometimes we're talking about the default network. People, it's that maybe where selves live in part. It is changed by psychedelics, and certainly if you take a large enough dose of something, you're often in a very different self than any of the selves you're normally in. But the key thing is not so much where you go to, but how you address yourselves and the particular self you're in as you're coming down. As you're integrating. I mean, the term integration both applies to the short-term integration from that session in real time and to what comes after it. And that's become a lot more popular, people doing journaling and offering courses. But I'm thinking first that as you're coming down into the jello of your brain, body, mind is recongealing into something like its normal form, it's very good to be aware of which self you're in, especially because this is where people often encounter traumatized selves, or selves that have terrible pain, or sometimes selves that have creative, brilliant, amazing ideas. You should be prepared to get some of that down. So, Jim has said that he feels that selves are the cornerstone of integration, and that if you don't know which self you're working with, if you don't know that you have different selves, it's going to be a lot harder to recognize it. There might be a self that's just hiding a little bit right now, but is very traumatized and wants to come out and wants to work with somebody. And this is why people who are doing therapy and doing guided sessions, it's very good for them to have a general understanding of the reality of selves in people's lives, and that they might not be working with the client in the same part of who they are, when they're at the peak or coming down from their experience. I think it's also really important in setting intentions. Because I have a lot of me that is just, even though part of me believes in things that are wildly new agey and most scientists think are unbelievable, a lot of me is skeptical and goes, it doesn't really make any difference. I'm only going to be taking, a half a gram of psilocybin. I know where I'm going to go. I'm not going to go that far. But if I am wise enough to get into the part of me that knows how to set ritual space and maybe write down a goal or two for that, that day, inevitably I'll be much more productive and have a much better experience. So, you might have a skeptical self and a self that's willing to just, suspend disbelief, because it's more effective if you suspend disbelief, because then you're working consciously with the placebo process, and whatever healing or creativity or whatever you're looking for is more likely to come about. There is also a chance with some people that they will move into an anxious or unhappy self when they take psychedelics, and that they will, kind of get stuck there. And so that should be something, you're aware of, especially if you're not that experienced, if you're working with more of a heavy dose.
Like stuck there afterwards is what you're speaking to.
Yeah. Right. When you'll come back and you'll integrate, and you'll not have really looked at what you needed to while you were in that window to process it, either by, maybe you're facing grief. Like I had to make the decision, which wasn't very hard when I first got I first realized just how sick my mother really is a month ago. The next day, after being triggered by going to Rosh Hashanah services and hearing the prayers in Hebrew and all that, I had to spend 20 minutes under the covers crying and shaking because my mom is going to die and she's really sick. And there was part of me that had to, if I hadn't let that part out and gotten in touch with that part, the next 3 weeks, including going to see her, would have been much worse. So when the pre-grief comes, I go with it because that part of me is really real and valid and needs attention. So, if you're doing psychedelics and something comes up, it's better to almost always to, air it out and work with it. And hopefully you have a backup plan so that if things don't go, you have a trip sitter or a community of people, or you have somebody, always at least have somebody you can call, if not somebody in your home, they can help you work with that part. I also did a whole Zoom session with Dr. Daniel Reeders, who's a friend of mine, a medical doctor and cardiologist, but he's also a shaman. He's worked with Alberto Villoldo. And our whole talk was about the overlap between soul retrieval in indigenous systems and working with selves that have been traumatized on psychedelics and bringing them back in. So it's a lot of the same skills and knowledge. All of you have to be present and healthy and happy, as the Hmong people say, if you're going to be happy, healthy, and sane. And so what psychedelics can easily alert you, can highlight, can bring energy to the part of you that needs the healing work. I find that more true on psilocybin than LSD, but there's an ongoing, controversy about whether they're really any different ultimately, or whether we just think they're different. But to me, they seem different, and I get to. For example, I was on a fairly high dose of mushrooms, and I realized there was something in me that shouldn't be in there, like right here. And I was instructed, if that's the word, it wasn't like I heard a voice in English or received them, but I knew that I probably had intestinal parasites. And then I started, as gross as it is, looking at the toilet bowl, and then I was able to spot and find that I do, and then get some treatments for them. But it was like, the mushrooms told me, because I was into the space that was open to what they were going to tell me at that moment. So, I think part of it is just, depending on how high you're going to go, how far out you're going to go, is just being willing to let go of all of your ordinary selves and, see what is meant to come in. But, if you have a creative endeavor, like when Jim did his creativity studies with these scientists back in up through 67 before, the government ended all that kind of stuff, they had these people working on really hard problems in all areas of industry for months. They would have to write out what it was, and then they came in and I think they did 200 micrograms. And something like 44 to 47 of these people came up with successful technical solutions in their trip that day, because they had been really primed and they stayed with that self. And and maybe a self that needs a cry might have come out and they handled that. But because these were hard-nosed scientists and it was set for the creativity, they probably didn't go there, and the music wasn't set to do that kind of individual healing work. But yeah, I just think it's clear that psychedelics give you a lot more potential awareness of yourselves, notwithstanding the problem that you might get stuck with one or see one that you're not ready to handle if you're not prepared. But it kind of opens it up. And sometimes you do get that feeling of really seeing yourselves, several of them, more clearly all at once, almost to the point where you can almost be in what's called co-consciousness. We point out that there are a few people, and one of my friends is one of these people, who really hear their different selves talking all at the same time. That seems more like the kind of quote-unquote crazy stuff we see in books like When Rabbit Howls and even Billy Milligan, where there's active conversations of selves going back and forth. But these people seem fine, and they just have more access, and their experiences might be different. But, psychedelics are certainly, incredibly powerful, but they can be used for good or for ill. So if you have a baseline understanding that you don't have a single self, then when different ones of your cells come up or need attention or have a great solution that you normally never think of, it's like, no, we can't listen to that part of us. It's never been right. Remember when we were kids, it's like, you can let them all in and you can hear what the different parts of you have to say. And, whether it's loving them all up into the whole and doing healing, as our friend Kintler Stryker puts it, or whether it's, going deep on creativity or the healing of a specific kind of trauma to a part of you that was a very young age in a very certain way, certainly psychedelics prime the pump for this kind of work.
Hmm. Yeah, there's a couple of comments, like offhanded comments I'll make before I ask my next question, or not offhanded, sort of like single placed comments. One of which is Christopher Beisch, his work with, I don't know if you've ever read, I think it's called LSD in the Mind of the Universe because Inner Traditions was like, that's its name. I think he wanted to call it Diamonds from Heaven, but publishers. And he talks about his 20-year journey of taking very high dose LSD sessions over and over again. And with, as a trained philosopher, with the intention to map consciousness and like get to that one. And if you've never followed his stuff,
I have another one of his book, like The Coming of the New Millennium or something like that. That was like a 600-page, very long.
He had a Dark Knight Early Dawn was his
that's it.
Reincarnation book.
I got that.
He was secretly doing this LSD work during the time that he wrote that, nobody knowing, while he was still like an active professor. Anyways, it's an aside. My first interview I did with him, I think is probably my favorite interview I've ever done because of how we go through his story, and mostly because of him, more so than me. But like, that's an aside. His comment, and I did a journey work session with him, not session, like a workshop on like how he did it and how he framed his journeys, with the caution of us not doing what he did because he feels like it was too extreme, is him saying that at some point you get to a level of coherency where there's a kind of self, I'm using your language now, but there's a kind of self that can do the journey. And like, once you're in it, you like reconnect with it. You're like, oh yeah, this place. Now I remember. And that over time, that sort of self gets so coherent that you step into it very easily, and it feels really secure in the space of being there. And at that point, then you could actually you start going to another level of experience within the particular substance. So that's an aside, because I'm linking that now with your work about building selves. The other one is, for whatever, perspective you're holding with respect to IFS and the people, your in a relationship with the IFS community in your book aside, Robert Falconer, I did an interview with him about IFS and psychedelics, and he made a point which I think serves what you're speaking to, which is that he'll never do something about never to do a psychedelic session with somebody whose parts aren't all on board with the decision.
Oh yeah.
Right. And if there's any parts that are like not having it, that forcing it to happen is either going to make the experience really not great, or the sort of other side of the experience is going to be that sort of metaphor that you put about the beach ball under the water. And this part that didn't want to do it is going to come back something fierce afterwards. You might have more problems after the session than you did going in. And I felt like that little anecdote which actually brings into, I had another question about integrating selves against their will, but given with respect to the time we have left, what I'd like to ask you, two questions about psychedelics before sort of like asking you a little bit more. One question about like how people can like right now today integrate a Healthy Selves Model perspective as their like first step. What would you suggest? Okay, so the two questions are this. One, is a response to what you're saying, and I put that aside. But the first one is, how do you feel about the sort of common rhetoric that happens right now? It's in the science. It's in the science, I think, very much because of Robin Carhart Harris and the way he frames it. But it's in the larger culture too, which is that psilocybin, psychedelics, they sort of like soften the ego, they reduce the ego, they kill the ego death. We talked about Freud and all the issues with respect to why the concept of the ego even exists, and the single self assumption, etc. How do you feel about the sort of like the almost universality of that framing of understanding psychedelic experiences? Is there any problems you see, and do you have a suggestion for how we might understand what's happening when the ego is softening without using the term or the concept of an ego?
Gee, that's a good question. And I don't know that I was aware that that's become that universal of concept, but let's say you're right about that, because you probably know better than I. I mean, the way to translate it is that psychedelics make people more aware that they don't have a single self that is always the same, which they think of as their ego. If you're that one crystallized thing that's always the same, and then start becoming, especially through psychedelics, that you have these different valences, these different cells, these different parts, and it's sort of the same thing. It's just that the term ego is used as this overarching term. It's a proxy for the single self assumption, really. So I don't know if it's killing it. I think psychedelics make you more aware of your different selves. Now, maybe they make the self that's more selfish and hard to be with and is unkind to people and is not open. Maybe it sort of diminishes that part of who we are in a lot of people. The fact that the technical rational grammar of late stage capitalism commodifies all relationships, and no matter what, we want to make sure we're taking advantage. And maybe there's a self like that we've all got because of how this culture and psychedelics, generally speaking, break that self down. But I like this idea that it's just kind of a proxy, because you're right, the word ego is out there everywhere, and as soon as people start talking about it, it's used in so many ways. Just like we wrote a chapter deconstructing dissociation, it would be easy to write a chapter deconstructing ego and showing that it doesn't really mean anything, generally speaking, and that if we and I'm back to the epicycles. If you have a healthy selves understanding and the healthy selves worldview, you understand that everyone has a number of different selves, then a lot of these subjects would be a lot easier to figure out and talk about, rather than continuing to put the single self assumption at the center of our cognitive solar system. It's a mistake. Everyone I've ever known has selves. But we don't start there because we've got 100 years of baggage and the single self assumption and all the stuff we've been talking about. So it takes a while till we actually get to talk about what we're really talking about and kind of get through the linguistic baggage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that. When I said kills the ego, it's mostly because of the near universal premise of the term ego death, which is ego death, how the degree of your ego death is the degree to which you're opening to a mystical type experience. Now, I personally recognize this as being I just think it's wrong descriptively as to what's actually happening and what the sort of purpose of psychedelic experiences might be generally, if there was sort of a general purpose. But that's what I was speaking to. And I think when you said the ego is used as a proxy for the single self assumption, I think that sort of speaks to it. And even my second question about how would you label it differently? I think in hindsight, you explained that when I asked you about psychedelics in general, which is these different selves come out and sort of different selves soften. Your comment about ego as a totally different sort of function, which is describe us being shitty people, right? Totally egotistical and blah, blah,
blah. That's in there half the time though. These things blend all the time, and they'll contrast that with the high self, the authentic self, and it's just fun to watch some of these rooms. I gave up trying to come into rooms Don Quixote tilting at linguistic windmills, because nobody likes that part of me. So
I gave up on Clubhouse too. I just felt like the listening experience, fidelity wise, was horrid, and I just some of the rooms I was tuning into, the psychedelic rooms, I was I just don't have time for this. I mean, it's good for me to inform how other people are talking, but as a participant, there are so many other things that I could be listening to that aren't me being what are you even talking about over and over again? Okay, so this time I hope that this is not too big of a question, although I can already tell you it's a big one. Okay, so setting the stage, in your book with Jim, you explicitly say something we're not going to talk about entities and spirits. You just said we're just not going to talk about those.
It's above our pay grade.
Sorry, and that was just it. I think later on you might have reaffirmed that you wouldn't talk about it, and then so you don't. So we're just putting a pin in that now. A couple of minutes ago, you talked about having an experience with recognizing the parasites, and you said the mushroom instructed me. The mushroom told me. Okay, so here's the question.
Yeah.
Is that mushroom a sort of mushroom presenting self of yours, or is it actually some intelligence beyond you? And if it's some intelligence beyond you, what does that say about the nature of entities and other intelligences generally? And what does it perhaps say about whether or not our inner multiplicity is, even outside of a psychedelic experience, perhaps occupied by intelligences or entities that are not actually of the me self?
Yeah, so you know that I can just tell you how I feel about this, that I don't really know anything about this.
Yeah.
I can tell you that I felt that the mushrooms are a living, and this is just me. I'm not speaking for Jim at all. When I was instructed by those mushrooms, it felt, I believe, I have experienced Gaia, the earth, as a goddess in neo-pagan festivals with substances and without, more than once. I believe the earth is a living conscious entity, and I know that she's real. And I experience it as feminine, and maybe that's what was communicating to me through the mushrooms. But that's about as far as I can go. I mean, I'm not that oriented towards past lives and spirits. I know there's a huge and burgeoning literature, including the Harvard guy, and like unbelievable things that sort of show it must really be real, but it's just not one of my favorite subjects. I could talk to you about parapsychology and ESP and Psi for a long time, because that is one of my favorite subjects. And I've interviewed some of the leading minds in the world on that and have my own feelings. And I know how real I feel that is. But when it comes to entities, I just, when my mom tells me that she still dreams about my dad every night, is my dad really visiting her on some level? I just, this is where I just, want to just kind of, go back to wonder and go, that is all so much bigger than my, really, I use the term pay grade, but I'm on that level. I'm not that deep a thinker. I hate to say it. I'm a pragmatist, and I have, I like people like Jeff Kripal and Mutants and Mystics, and there's people I've been reading, for a long time, and think I know how it holds together, but I'm not all that interested in the big picture, other than to say things like, I think views like the Hindu cosmology, where mind is first and matter comes out of it, rather than Western science, which in 1600 has been exactly the opposite and led to the flat landing, where we don't believe anything that's going on inside of us is really true or real, leading all the way up to some people these days never having any time in their days whatsoever where they're not being influenced by the input of other minds. I mean, I think that kind of stuff is important, but the level of entities and beings like that, I could tell you, I think I have a special relationship with the Hindu god Kartikeya, but that's just the really new agey part of me, right? I don't have any proof or science. I can tell you about some amazing things and give you stories, but when we get to science, qua science, and especially in the realm of, and Jim and I are working on this in the book, I don't know if we'll go that far into it, about, citizen science and whether you have to have double-blind randomized, even when you're working with things like microdoses, does that make any sense? Does it work at all? I mean, that's sort of where I'm interested. I know I'm not answering your question.
No, that's okay. That's okay. The thing is that, like, I would be surprised if you had a coherent, definite answer to that question. I wouldn't be surprised that one could exist in you if you brought forth, okay, cool, you got a thoughtful answer, but I don't know if there is such an answer to that question. So I really appreciate that you attempted to field it, because I knew it was a big and difficult question. And I'll invite the listeners to sort of listen to that question again and then ask themselves how they might answer it.
I mean, if I thought it would do a lot of good to actually try to figure out what I know and what's been known to the ultimate level, then I'd be like another Ken Wilber trying to do what he did. I'm not that guy. I'm a guy who's, I like to ride the outside of a lot of different areas and become experts in things when I help somebody write. Like, I'm sort of an expert in mindfulness until I forget everything we wrote about in that book that I did with my client, Scott Rogers. And I understand things that I didn't understand before. And that's why I was, he talks about this concept of constructive solitude, the idea that every day you should spend at least a little time without the input of any other minds, as a practice, because then you can tune into what's actually going on inside of you. Well, you have to believe that there are things going on inside of you. and that all of reality isn't just what's externally verifiable to believe that. So for a lot of people, they never, there's always something going on. And I've seen in younger generations, my nephew had a guy over, I guess it was 15 years ago. He never took his cell phone out of his hand. Even when he was eating dinner with us, he was already functionally a cyborg. He had already given up a constant data input stream. He always had to have it on or he was very uncomfortable. I think we have to move in the opposite direction and have a lot more questions and recognize, we know very, very, very little. And that's not going to change by, having a definitive theory about what's absolutely true, which is why a lot of rooms I'll leave, because people really feel they have definitive solutions or spiritual systems that explain everything. It's the Kabbalion or it's Hindu stuff or it's the Torah, it's like, yeah, this is now. Those things all inform us, but this is a radically postmodern world. We don't even understand modernism to get to postmodernism yet, So let's just deal with the fact that it's very weird that all these spooky internal psychological and spiritual things are real, even though our best science says ignore all of that stuff. None of it's real. We have to live in that kind of tension between those two poles all the time. Which is a pain in the butt. Go ahead.
I chose to be quiet because I just wanted to let that ring out, like a mic drop or something, because I thought it was a beautiful sort of arc that you went on there.
I don't know what I'm saying anymore, so I'm glad you're enjoying
it. Well, I mean, from this side of the podcasting table, it's good work.
No, I'm glad.
Okay, so I had another question. I'm not going to ask it. It's an aside.
Well, I do want to say about that thing about not forcing, selves, not killing selves. There was this whole thing, first there was the progressive therapists. They figured out that this whole model of people when they were young and being abused physically or sexually or whatever, they would split off another part of themselves and that would enable them to not go crazy. This is an evolutionary adaptive mechanism. This is a good thing. And that was one strain, but at the same time you had people through hypnosis and sometimes, sorts of chemical castration types of things where they would fuse or basically force a self to die. And that was the goal. And even today with somebody like Beyonce, she used to have Sasha Fierce that used to let her perform, but then with the help of a therapist, she integrated all of herself and Sasha Fierce doesn't exist anymore. We think that this whole thing of forcing selves that do exist to not be is like killing part of who you are. And it's almost always a mistake and it almost never really works. I mean, I'm not saying it's working out for Beyonce, that's like a different level, but it's like you have these parts, you have to find a way to love them all up into the whole. You can't exile them. You can't get rid of them. You can't, you see all these business rooms. It just drives me freaking crazy. And they'll go, you know what? You have to never listen to that voice of doubt again. You have to never even entertain the part of you who have questions. You have to be in that oneself. You have to be the single-minded fanatic that can achieve no matter what. And honestly, also why I moved away from any work with Tony Robbins, because he goes there. And I'm just not into being a single self fanatic. My inner poet, my inner singer, my inner dancer. I did a lot of ecstatic dance, which I love in the last 5 years of the pandemic. My inner, all these things, they're very real and very important. If I don't understand part of me yet, then I have to open to it, not try to shove it away and force it away and get rid of it and castrate it and kill it. That doesn't work. That's mean and bad. It shouldn't happen. Even if you have a part of you that has, is doing absolutely crazy stuff, then you have to work with that part. It needs therapy. It might even need, God forbid, one of these, antidepressants that we give out so freely. It might need something for a while, but what it doesn't need is to be made worse and made wrong. And those are people who end up doing even worse things or killing themselves. And it's not a good approach. So we do eschew that approach and say it's almost never the right approach.
So if you've got 2 or 3 minutes to go over,
you got me.
Yeah. Okay. Because
I'm good. This is fun.
Okay. Well, all right. So I'm going to get a bit selfish here. Would you got 5 or 6 minutes to go over?
Yeah, whatever you need. We're this deep in. Let's go for it. Okay, I don't want you to be unsatisfied.
So I've only got 2 questions, one of which I'm about to ask, and the other one is, for the listeners, what would you suggest as a first thing that they can do? And then how can people find your book and yada, 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 this thing. Okay. Here's the question. And I think I'm going way back up on the abstraction ladder to a few minutes ago.
That's okay. We have fun with that.
Which is, earlier you were talking about coming down and you were saying like, I feel comfortable in being like a soul, there being a soul.
Yeah.
This is just sort of an invitation of wondering how you respond to this question. Is that a single soul, right? And how is that single soul assumption any different than a single self assumption, except that the single soul assumption is wearing very spiritual clothes?
Well, that's a great question. And I guess it is a single soul assumption, because I am viewing it as this autopoietic whirlpool, this evolutionary dynamic mechanism that karmically and energetically and just from physical world influences, everything sort of comes in and it moves out, but it's not a self in that it doesn't have a personality. At least not one that it's like when Jim used to joke to people, okay, if you have a single self, tell me what its favorite restaurant is, or describe some of its characteristics. It's sort of trans ordinary human. It's not like the rest of me. You couldn't, it's on that level of question, like, are we ever going to be able to explain scientifically why water is wet to our taste and experience? How do you get something wet from these two things that before, hydrogen, oxygen, weren't wet? This is sort of like Kant asking how are synthetic a priori, answers possible. How do we know that 1 + 3 = 4 ahead of time, even before we've done it? So I don't know the way that my soul is different than a single self. And, you may have just offered a very simple translation, because if I was going to write a follow-up book, it would be a translation manual so people could understand how a lot of the ideas that they're using already, if they just had this backdrop and tried running their ideas, they would see their ideas would be better. So you should use this thing. It's not anti what you're doing. It's going to help you. So I don't know how to translate single soul, because I would say, I don't feel like I have multiple souls. I feel there's just this me, the thing that I became eventually aware of, and that holds it all together, and I assume stays together when you die, but I have no idea. But when you ask that question, I will cogitate on it further. I will cipher on it further, because it's a really good question. If I'm just kind of pushing it back a definitional level, but I think the answer that it doesn't, have any of the characteristics of selves. It's not a self state. It's not a physical state in me. It's, if selves are self states, and self states are recurring patterns of mind body chemistry, energy perception, and behavior in a human being. It feels to me like my soul is not in a human being in the same way, but is holding together all these other parts of me that is a human being. I don't know if that's a good answer or not. I may be logically, in violation of itself, but that's the best I can do.
Well, it might be logically inconsistent, but I didn't, or in violation of itself, I didn't detect any. I'll leave it to the listeners to point it out. But I would say that it was, in my perspective, a good answer, and I appreciate it.
That's a good question.
Okay. So how would people take what they've heard here today, and just because you talked about being very pragmatic, how would people be able to take everything they've heard today and translate that into how they might, now show up, hello kitty cat, show up with, the dishes or something to this effect? Like, how do you show up now? This is such like a classically Zoom moment with the cat, like totally like post-pandemic Zoom thing.
Friend, he's got diabetes. It's been a long journey, but he's doing pretty well. No, you can't get to that water right now. I'm going to move the cat.
Okay. Yes. Okay. For the listeners, there was a kitty cat that made their way onto the camera. It makes me think of that thing that went around during the pandemic of the lawyer who accidentally signed in, and he with the thing that made him look like a cat.
Right.
And he's like, "Oh, I'm sorry." And then at some point he goes, "I'm not actually a cat."
No, I didn't hear about that.
Oh my
So,
God. So how
the
would people
practical,
apply it? Yeah. Yeah.
well, okay. So obviously they should think about the book. The paperback is my favorite way to look at the book because it's got a lot of fun pictures, David Bowie. It's got cartoons, like 10 cartoons that are just, making the point that it's in all these levels of culture. The audio book, though, the Audible has been the most popular. But, even going beyond all of that, we don't really have a theory. We have an idea. The idea is that everyone you've ever known has different selves. So just try playing with that idea with you. And when you run into people in the world, see if working with this idea makes life a little bit easier and better. When you're a little bit down or don't want to do something, just acknowledge that that's the part of you that you're in now. Or if you need to kind of get going and you're being a little bit too tardy, say out loud, we really have to get a move on now. Try the we thing, or try calling yourself, Jordan's, you need to get up or you're going to be late. You don't like being late. So there's a lot of little ways, it's if mental health is being in the right mind at the right time, by understanding that you and everyone has different minds or parts or selves or alters, we have a list of 70 terms for it. If that's true, then it should be easy to leverage that in very non-dramatic ways. Just, stay with the part of you that actually wants to stick with the good diet and not go for the Reese's Pieces. Stay with the part of you that can be kind and hold your tongue, even though you want to act back. And even though you've been interrupted, you want to interrupt. You're not going to do that right now because you're just going to listen and hear what people say. It's just, we feel that there's an innate kind of healing that happens when you recognize that you have different selves. They start talking to each other. Healing is, automatically and it starts happening of its own accord. So, the real way to start is just look at the single self assumption. See if you really believe that it's true, that there's only one you, and that everything, I have a close friend. He's a well-known integral author. And he's like, yeah, but, you're the same you I knew when we were in law school together. Like you're, and I'm like, yeah, but I'm also not. And it's like, there are slight valences and nuances that you can begin to tease out in whatever situation you're in, right now whatever you do. If you're working and you're a service person, really get that meme that's gone around that you have no idea what people have gone through and what's been going on in their day. This person somebody died. This person lost their job. It's easier to be kind to other people when you recognize that they have different selves, and some of them are not happy and some of them aren't healthy and some of them aren't working well. And it's easier to be easy on yourself when you recognize that even though you just screwed up and made the same mistake you've always made, whatever that is, it's not that big a deal, or you don't really have to beat yourself up. And I tend to catastrophize, and it's like, you don't have to do that. I can move into a part of me that's like, okay, I mean, some of this isn't all that different than something like cognitive behavioral therapy, right? You're just looking at how you're talking to yourself and which self is talking. But if you have the backdrop that the single self assumption is wrong and we all have different selves, then a lot of things very easily start making more sense without a lot of effort. So it's, when you start on the selves journey, there's a lot of low hanging fruit. It's pretty easy. I know that if I don't get into the part of me that's going to do my stretching and all that stuff, in the first hour or two of waking up, I often don't get to it at all. And that doesn't make me happy later on. And so we all know that. All the Jordans know that. And usually we'll do that stretching. When you get older, you realize you have to stretch every day. It's like, yeah, if we don't, we're going to have back pain. Do we want back pain? No. Is any of us happier? Well, the part of me that likes to drink more coffee and read more news and screw around for the first hour and a half, it's not so happy. But you know what? When we bring up to that part that you can have more time later in the day and the rest of us won't hurt, it usually agrees. So it's like, that's almost like a caricature of it or a cartoon of it. Some people like to list out all their different selves and, get all, and it's not like I'm not a list person. I mean, this is my daily practice grid, which I haven't been really attending to, although I've been doing all the things without having to check them, which is really the idea. So you don't have to keep track, but I like that sort of thing. And I like exercises, and I like having hot seats and, writing a letter for your different, or sending letters from one part of you. I mean, all that stuff is fun, but it's almost like more of a sideshow than the real thing of just getting that, your friend or your wife, your kid, sometimes kids are able to learn new things and sometimes they're not. We call it a teachable moment. If they're in a self where they can learn something, great. If they're not, it almost has never worked in the history of humanity to say, could you move into the teachable moment self so I can just tell you why you have to lock the door each time? That's never going to work. If you have, you'll just, it's just an easy way to be more effective and happier, whether you're searching for the single self or for zero selves, whether you're an athlete or a scholar or don't care about any of that stuff. It's just, if we're built that way, it would be good to know and to gently explore it. It doesn't cost you anything. You don't have to learn anybody else's system or terminology. What we've given you here, just a few terms and ideas, is more than enough to begin the exploration. And then, once you've got your camel's nose under the tent, you might start looking around and go, oh, cool, there's this, there's psychosynthesis, there's lifestyle. What about Gestalt? What about Virginia Satir and what she did with the NLP people? What about, other people who are like specifically having psychedelic sessions where they're trying to explore their different selves? I haven't actually heard of, but could be a thing. I mean, there's a lot of ways to run with it if the single self assumption is really not optimal. And that's what we think.
All right. Well, thank you. Just the last moment is, are there any links or social media handles that you'd like people to check out? Links to your book, Your Symphony of Selves, will be contained in the show notes of this episode, so you don't have to worry about that unless you have a particular place you want people to buy it.
Well, we did put together a nice website, which I learned last week is down, and I haven't gotten back to until we get the proposal for this next book. So, you can find me on LinkedIn if you want to learn about me. You can read about the book on Amazon.com. You can go to the Inner Traditions website as well, where they talk about it. I do like some of the stuff I did in Clubhouse back in November. I think that's the most like advanced talk I've given, maybe except this one now, because you did get into a lot of nuance. But I would just say, start with the book. If if you've got $20 and you want to see what we're talking about for a 454-page book with cartoons and pictures and a whole lot of history and information, and especially if you're a history buff, if you want to know what went down with Charcot and Genet and Binet and all those guys, I mean, I'm really into that because I was the one that did the sleuthing on that. Some people don't care. Some people, want to see, what we said about, the book was meant to be sort of a tour de force through philosophy and religion and neuroscience and psychology and postmodernism. And so, there's a lot of different things in there, and we left a lot out. I've learned things I didn't know about since the book started, but the book is our best effort to put that all together. When my website comes back in, it's just yoursymphonyofselves.com or jordangruber.com. That should work again. But I'm pretty easy to find out there on Facebook, LinkedIn, places like that, and have a pretty regular presence in the Clubhouse. So, and I'll be getting a with credit on Jim's next book when that comes out, and that's more about microdosing, of course. So I'll be around for a while.
Awesome. Well, Jordan Gruber, besides a thank you for this wonderful book here that I'm holding up on the screen on for those on YouTube, I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, me too. This was fun. I thought there were 3 or 4 moments of like advancing the ball and minor epiphanies, and maybe just a couple of novel utterances, things that nobody has said the way they said that we hit to today. So I would say it was a great, very productive conversation. I want to thank you for your careful preparation and just, the way you engaged me.
Thank you. And on that note, cut. Okay. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Adventures Through the Mind and making it all the way to the end here. Really appreciate it. If you liked what you heard here from today, from Jordan Gruber, do check out his book co-authored with James Fadiman, Your Symphony of Selves. You can find it at any bookstore that you go to. I encourage you to purchase from your local bookstore. Chances are they can order it in if they don't already have it for the same price you'd pay on one of the major multi-conglomerate bookseller people. I know you know who I'm talking about. And you're also supporting an independent bookstore if you do so. So encourage that. But otherwise, you can get it in all different online sources, and it's linked in the description to this episode. In the show notes of this episode, links to getting the book. Same with all the links Jordan had just mentioned about where you can follow more of his work, follow him online. Also, all at jameswjesso.com. So thanks so much for listening, and I will see you on the next episode of Adventures of the Mind. So until then, take care.